Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. This is the show where I speak with the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Joanne Conway. I've known Joanne for a number of years, and every single time we speak, we end up getting into an extended conversation talking about data, which is one of those things that I find personally fascinating. Joanne has recently joined DLA Piper as the head of Inclusion and Culture International. She's embarking on a doctorate on privilege and inclusion at the moment, as if that wasn't enough on top of everything else that she does. She's been proud to be listed on various different women's awards, the Northern Power Women's Future Top 50 list, along with various other leading awards for building equitable and diverse businesses. Welcome to the show, Joanne.
Thank you. What an intro. Delighted to be here.
Well, it's great to be speaking to another northern girl.
I know.
And anyone who didn't know you might look at the profile and go, "Oh my goodness, you know, finance, psychology. This girl, she's got it all. She's talking about data. She's now doing more education." But it wasn't actually all that way. And you know, one thing I've become very fascinated in recently is data, but not just data from a what does the data tell us kind of point of view, but those that may not have ended up, the data would have told us would not end up in a position of influence or power have. And I think that you are absolutely one of those people. So tell us how it started and tell us a little bit more about the journey, Joanne.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's so important. I think the you know, we only see kind of glimpses of people, and that's why I'm quite vocal on my LinkedIn platform, because I think it's really important that I use my voice for good in terms of being able to share the good, you know, and the challenging as well, and also just to shine a spotlight, like you say, that people like me can actually progress to big, you know, within big organizations in senior roles. So I'm a northern woman at heart, originally from Dublin. So both my parents are Irish, and I was actually born in Lancashire in a small town called Padiham near Burnley. And if you look at all of the statistics and in terms of kind of my upbringing, growing up with an alcoholic parent, grew up for the majority of my childhood on free school meals, grew up in council estates, and, you know, really, I guess, some of the most disadvantaged areas that I lived in growing up. And one of the things that I always found was a safe place for me was school and education, and I thrived in that. And that's why my love of learning, I guess, really came from. So I from a very young age, had this aspiration that I wanted to be more, and I didn't know what that was, but I knew that I you know, that I wanted to achieve as much as I could. But like you said, there were barriers in my way, I guess, similar to other people like me, which meant that I left school having completed my GCSEs, and so I didn't actually go on to college. I didn't go on to university. My main priority was actually just moving out of home, finding a place to live, and that meant going into full-time work. So did a range of jobs, from factories to working in McDonald's to petrol stations to customer services. And I always say that, you know, those roles are a real testament to my leadership and added to the skills and experiences that I have.
John, thank you so much for sharing, in particular about, you know, the early humble beginnings. I love that you've mentioned that one of your parents was an alcoholic, because I really don't think the disease, frankly, that addiction is talked about nearly enough. And you know, the way that you describe things, it's almost like the evolution of Joanne as she goes from you know, the Irish, the Dublin roots to, you know, then growing up in Lancashire school meals to now being at the helm of a law firm. You know, when you speak about the journey, it's almost just like you can remember it like it was yesterday. And you know, I think things like that are really so important to remember where you come from, to you know, not kind of sit on that pedestal and forget about where you have been. But clearly growing up in that kind of environment, clearly with loving parents, albeit with some of the hardships that living in a slightly kind of deprived surroundings gives to you, you've had the resilience to come through that. How did you do that, other than obviously using school and education as that safe comfort blanket?
Yeah, I think it's really I talk about it because can be a taboo topic, and I think what comes with that, and certainly as I've posted stuff on LinkedIn and shared some of my story, I've had people message me privately and say that they've gone through similar. There's a lot of shame actually as you're growing up, as any certainly from my perspective as a young girl, as a teenager, a lot of shame. There's a lot of things in terms of when you go to work, the things that you've had to deal with. Perhaps you've been up all night, you're in school, you're not quite sure what you're going to go home to. There's lots of uncertainty. So for me, it gave me a lot of skills that I have today, which is around resilience. It is around managing uncertainty. I can deal with massive problems because actually, in the grand scheme of things, what I've dealt with, it's not that big. So everything is contextual. So building networks of people around me that I trust has been really helpful. So I've got some friends that were friends back when we were teenagers that have remained friends. So for me, trust is really important, and building relationships, and as a leader, doing what you say you're going to do. I think that's a really important thing, and not having that certainty growing up has really instilled that as a core value for me. It's what I expect of myself, and it's what I really look around and aspire to see in leaders is really stepping up, and if you say you're going to do something, to really do it even when it gets tough.
Absolutely, stepping up to the plate and knowing that accountability is real. Sadly, I do see leaders who kind of make it up to the top and forget what it used to be like, and don't realize the power that not only their voice has, but the actions bring into the workplace, both internally and externally. Because the role that you are now, but also the role that you were in, is an influential role. The roles which are CEO minus say 3 to 5 or thereabouts, those are the roles that have the greatest impact factually on driving external stakeholder engagement and internal stakeholder engagement. Why? Because those are full-time positions within the organization. No offense, of course, to the board, but they are external advisors. They're independent. Those that work full-time in positions of power have the influence and the ability to really drive change, and do that at a significant level, because you're advising people externally, whether it be investor relations, whether it be bringing on new talent, to also influencing those that look up the corporate hierarchy and go, hey, do you know what, one day I'd love to be like Joanne, which is really why I love you talked about the LinkedIn platform. And corporate execs are making the most now of various different platforms, which is a growing trend that we've seen. This uptick for personal branding, which I think 10 years ago would have sounded quite icky, but personal branding now is about engagement, and it is a significant necessary in a world where we can't rely on running off to a crisis communications firm all the time, each and every time someone accidentally says a whoopsie that they shouldn't do.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think there's a lot of, we've talked about this around creating space for leaders to be able to learn and to grow. And that's one of the things I've talked about in my doctorate, when I'm looking at the topic of privilege and inclusion, which can be quite a sensitive and topic, is actually meeting leaders where they are and really being able to create an environment where you can start to see the change. And some of the leaders that I've worked with in the past are really up for making a difference, and just need to really some support in terms of what that looks like, and then are quite confident. They build that confidence and that capability to be able to go on and do more things. So I think that's part of it, and I think being able to do that and have a conversation without having binary views is really important as well. I think sometimes we feel like it has to be, if you think one thing, you can't think another. or if you're for one group, you're against another group. And I think that becomes really complicated. And actually, in my role and in the work that I do, and I know others, like you want to do, is around creating inclusion and for all communities and all groups, and it doesn't have to be at the expense of another, which is what I see sometimes, which can set the agenda backwards, and then it stops people from actually feeling like they can contribute or speak up because they're almost frozen into being afraid of saying anything.
Joanne, I always learn so much when I'm speaking to you, and I'm really excited to talk about the doctorate, actually. A fellow geek when it comes to diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, culture. Privilege runs deep, and it changes, interestingly, throughout individuals and organisations' lives. Talk to us a little bit about what privilege is, why it's so incredibly important, and also why did you choose to study this when you're already a subject matter expert?
Yeah, thank you. Well, similar to you, I am a geek and I absolutely love learning. So that's my I said I'd stop after my master's, and then I had a couple of years break and back into it again. But so privilege is it describes the benefits that belong to people because they either fit into a specific social group or they have certain dimensions to their identity. And privilege is a social construct, so it's therefore relative. So what that means is that every individual will experience privilege or lack privilege depending on how they categorize themselves. It will depend on how the context that they're in and the situation. So it moves within time and within the context that I'm in. So I may hold privilege in one environment, and then I might go to another one and lack privilege because those surroundings around me have changed. So it is a social construct. And I think the reason that the reason that I'm really interested in the topic of privilege is that when I first started to look at this, because of what I've shared about my personal background, I always felt that I didn't have privilege. I probably would have felt quite defensive if you said that I was privileged. I would have said, well, look at my background, look what I've been through. That's not me. I'm definitely not privileged. But all of us that work in professional services, all of us that have these roles, we're all privileged, by the fact that we have these experiences and these roles. But what I realized was that I have privilege, but I can also lack privilege at the same time. So I have privilege by the fact that I am white, by the fact that I'm able-bodied, by the fact that so many different dimensions, but that doesn't take away my lived experience. It doesn't mean that I didn't go through hard times, that there were times in my life where there were barriers in my way that weren't in other people's way. So I lacked privilege, but I can still have that and have privilege. And that was a really interesting piece for me, that kind of aha moment. And when I started to talk to leaders about this in my role as a practitioner, I noticed that there were different levels of reactions around privilege. People were like, I'm not privileged. I didn't go to a private school, or I'm not privileged. And I'm thinking, you work in this massive, or we're all privileged, but it's how you say it. The language is really important. And actually, when we talk about privilege, we're talking about advantages, we're talking about disadvantages, we're talking about barriers, we're talking about having access to things in different ways. So when I started to have a conversation by opening around, tell me where you lacked privilege, and then talk about where you have privilege, it was a much better conversation, because people are human beings and they have had experiences and they matter. So jumping straight into talking about where someone's privileged is not always the best, way. I think you have to understand where people are on the journey and allow them to reflect on that. So yeah, that's why I'm really interested in it. And I'm particularly interested in how leaders self-conceptualize their own privilege and whether that will influence how they include others at work or not.
That is so interesting, and I'm also going to try that next time, because I noticed, like you, that the second you mention the word privilege, you can almost see people slightly, physically tightening up in front of eyes. And it does evoke that emotive reaction that wants to get on the back foot or the defensive. And so it's a much nicer way to openly ask, because we all have privilege, albeit at very different levels, and we can also grow into privilege. I've just been speaking to a
absolutely.
wonderful leader from a very well-known hotel group who's joining on the podcast soon, and she's a Jamaican woman, and she was talking about how much privilege she has. And I thought it was just fascinating, because the second we hear the word privilege, we instantaneously think white. And then we probably think male after that, where actually there's far more to meet the eye than the pure surface level. And that's what I'm getting from when I'm hearing you speak about this, because you're saying ultimately, let's hold the mirror up. Let's look at how we perceive our own reflection. Is that a realistic assessment of how we view ourselves? Do leaders accurately see the right reflection when they look into that mirror? But then also, how can we unpick the lenses of privilege in order to become a better leader? Because there's always areas where we haven't necessarily had it all, and I don't know a person that would say that they have.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one of the main reasons that I'm interested in, so I'm looking to contribute to academia, but also to a business problem. So it will be, I'm halfway through my research, and when I'm finished, the plan is that I will have a model or a framework that will bring leaders through that and signpost to things that accelerate that journey. Because what I have seen where that works really well is where when leaders have actually gone on that journey and really started to understand their own privilege, and had space to understand where they've lacked privilege, but where they have privilege, they can then look at the employee and the organization life cycle and start to notice where there may be barriers in place for some groups that provide advantages, disadvantages, and start to unpick those. Because really what we want to get to is, how do we make the systemic change? It's never about fixing individuals. How do we make sure that we set up our processes so that they are equitable, so that they provide equal opportunities that result in equitable outcomes. And the more that people can really see that they're not set up in that way at the moment, or some may not be, they're more likely to take action. So I'm always thinking about, what's the action? How can we influence the behaviors that are positive? So that's my plan, hopefully.
Definitely, not hopefully.
Yes, definitely.
I clearly, like me, find the word framework very sexy. I find frameworks so fascinating. Others, conversely, will be like, oh God, another framework. But I think we need more frameworks. We need frameworks of understanding with which to, as you rightly pointed out, dismantle the processes and systems that historically have been in place that have accentuated those systematic biases. And without breaking the systems that we've had and creating new, exciting frameworks that allow us to evolve, we're never going to get anywhere. And we're also never going to be able to scale. So you could put something perfect in place in a small kind of microcosm environment. But like anything, in order for it to be successful, in it to have a greater impact, then it really must scale. And so we need to have those frameworks are essential for life and for successful business. I think I told you a while ago that I'd done this 6-week course that, I swear it nearly killed me, 6-week course at Cambridge on the wealth economy framework. And it's interesting because 2025, I think, is going to be a real watershed moment, not only for the implementation of new sexy frameworks like ours, but also for things like the wealth economy to really come into play. And, the wealth economy talks about what wealth is. How do you go beyond the classic kind of GDP, USD that we look at wealth within the context of, and go deeper? And, privilege comes into a big part of this, because the aspects of measuring wealth transcend into things like knowledge capital, human capital? Could you and I have a successful, flourishing relationship and business relationship without social capital and the glue that holds us together? And then questionably, if you were to leave where you're at, does that social capital walk out the door? I would vote yes. And so, you know, then you kind of layer into privilege into that, you layer in all of these other social aspects, which historically people say, well, it's so hard to measure. How do we measure those? And, you know, even right now, there is not a framework that sustainably measures the S. But all the ones that we did some research on, because my former tutor for the wealth economy, I asked him to do with someone else a piece of research for us. I commissioned it, and they looked at every framework that measures social capital, and guess what? Diversity and inclusion featured in every single one, but the other measures for S were different. And you add on top of that the fact that 2025 is going to be this watershed moment. You know, people are getting more comfortable with the fact that, you know, S is critical. We know about it. It's become more you know, it's more of a kind of everyday language, something that we know we can measure. There are, you know, certain accountability practices in place, but not the same for S. And so I, for one, I've got my hand waving for when your new framework comes out. That would be so brilliant. How do we, you know, it's almost like, could we have a privilege? So no, a privilege marker. You know, we have
there's so much to consider. There's there's a paper that I've been reading that's really, really interesting. It's around privilege, but it talks about this this model. It's called a 3D model, and it talks about deny, distance, and dismantle. So within that, it's a 3D model, and they're talking about, you know, when you look at privilege, you've got they come up with three options. So one is that people deny it, so they're like, I don't have any. You've got the other, which is distance. So it's kind of, I know that it's happening over there in the macro, but it's not actually in relation to me, or I can't do anything about it. So you just kind of distance yourself from it, or you can dismantle it. And that's the bit that I'm really interested in, is that how do we create spaces? How do we create what are the behaviors and the actions that people do that mean they are more likely to do it than others? That's really what I'm interested in, because then if you can find out where people, because we've got leaders that are really busy, you know, incredible leaders that still find the time to be really inclusive, they understand their privilege, they do all of these things, they're probably even more profitable. So how do we kind of look at what that is, that framework, and try to scale that and expand that? So that's what I'm really interested in. I think, you know, there's never any one size fits all, but I've seen a lot of research on privilege. There's quite a lot of research on inclusion. There hasn't been as much on privilege and inclusion together, which is the gap that I'm looking to contribute to. And in particular, I'm looking at that through the lens of race, gender, and class.
And given, I mean, I know that you're not all the way through the research yet, but what have you spotted and seen so far? And where have you seen examples play out in the workplace? And obviously you don't need to name names as to where it was, whether it's right now, whether it was in the former company, but I'd love to know, you know, some stories, some examples, what has worked and what hasn't.
Yeah, definitely. So there's so some of the themes I've had, so the first part of my doctorate has been reviewing all of the existing literature. So came back with about 10,000 papers. I've narrowed that down to 70 key papers, and some of the key things that came out were around invisible and visible privilege. So there's two kind of competing arguments around that. Some talk about how privilege is invisible. People don't know that they have privilege. And then there's the other argument that says, actually, people do know that they have privilege, but they choose to ignore it, or they actually change it so it suits themselves. So there's that piece around if we can make privilege more visible, are people more likely to be able to take action and do things? The other piece is around structural barriers that we talked about, and also the myth of meritocracy, which is definitely a theme that comes through. So this a kind of a running theme through that, where people and leaders or not even leaders, actually a lot of the studies that they've done are with people at all levels, talk about the myth of meritocracy, where people think that if you just work harder, then you will make it. So there is this, which I've definitely seen play out in terms of just that evolution around understanding meritocracy, because that entails the idea that wherever your social position at birth, society should give you enough opportunity for you to just progress to the top. And that's what we've been encouraged to believe, right? So we've been told if you try hard enough, you can make it. It doesn't matter about your race or your gender or your class or any identities on a fundamental level. If you work hard enough, that you'll be successful. And actually the problem with that contemporary idea of meritocracy is it doesn't acknowledge the fact that climbing the ladder can be harder for some people than others. So that's a piece that I'm really, really interested in. So where you can work with organizations and really start to help them understand that there probably isn't a meritocracy. And if there isn't a meritocracy, it's not a personal attack on them as an individual, because for some people, they really hold true to their values, that they are fair and they are just and they are true. And if they work in an organization where meritocracy doesn't exist, then that doesn't align with their values. And actually, it's more than likely outside. It's not about them. Obviously, they contribute to it, but there's historical and systemic things at play that mean that, you know, most organizations are not a meritocracy. And when you start to acknowledge that, then you can start to really understand how you can make a difference around it.
I totally agree, and I go as far to say I don't think any organisation is a meritocracy.
No, I'm yet to find one.
Yeah, I am too. If there's any out there, please write in and
Yeah.
and I know.
But it's about being on the journey, right? I think, you know, that's, you know, I've spoken to a lot of leaders, and, you know, and they've said, look, I can see that, and I want to be part of the solution. Like, what, you know, what can we do? And there's some fantastic work going on, really, really dismantling some of those barriers that exist. So that's what keeps me in this role. That's what keeps me excited.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And that's the great thing about diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity culture. It's just so rich and constantly evolving. I know people do say, oh, it'd be great if we didn't need it. And one day, hopefully, we'll not end up needing diversity and inclusion. And I always say that's kind of like saying you're done when it comes to culture. Culture's living, it's breathing, it's sleeping, it's eating. And
Yeah.
it's exactly the same for diversity. It's this never-ending rich smorgasbord of difference. And, you know, frankly, even taking gender as one of our facets, well, there's always going to be new generations, and those generations got an entirely different view on how they view the world of diversity and or privilege as a layer below the overarching kind of diversity aspect. But also, when we talk about the systemic bias that we've seen for so many years, it's going to be such a long time before we eradicate that. And I don't say that to sit here and be incredibly depressing, but we need to recognize that so much of this is historic. And whilst we might not understand what it's like to live in a time where there was, you know, slavery and complete kind of different laws to what there is right now, you know, over in Ireland, I mean, it really wasn't that long ago since it was not legal to have same-sex marriage.
Mm-hmm.
So to undo all of that will take a very long time. And you know, like myself, I think, you know, when you're a practitioner, you're so impatient. You're impatient because you want to see new things happen. You want to see change happen. Businesses want to see change happen. Oh, can't we just fix it? I've heard CEOs say, let's just fix it. Let's just sort something out. Hire new people. Fine. It's not something that can ever be fixed overnight. It is, you know, keep coming back to this evolutionary piece. It really is.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the one thing I would say, you know, that I really encourage, particularly, you know, practitioners, if they're working with leaders, like you say, they're so quite often quite eager to be like, what can we do? And they move into the action and the, you know, the shiny things, and they are important, and they send a symbol to your employees, but it's really, really important to stay in the fundamentals until they're ready. You know, really understanding, a lot of work I've done with leaders is really helping them to understand that there is actually a problem to solve and that they are part of the solution. Because if you just start moving into action and they don't genuinely believe that there is a problem to solve, because they might just think, well, we're all fair anyway, aren't we? Why are we doing it? Or we'll just go along with it. But actually, if you spend time and lay the foundations and really work with leaders around that, and again, to your point around being evidence-based, but also having the kind of the hearts and minds behind that, it will stay. Those foundations will mean that you have more success and you can accelerate faster, because otherwise you will move forward and you'll take one step forward and two steps back. So I think that's critical. And some of the hardest roles that we have in this is actually influencing leaders to stay with us there at the beginning and do that work that might not seem that exciting, but actually it's the most important part of it, and they're always grateful when they do, and they do reap the benefits of that.
Absolutely. I'm conscious of time. I know we said, oh, we'll do this for 20 minutes, and that's going to be the biggest challenge, and clearly we've not been 20 minutes.
I know we always love to chat. I know.
But no, I'd love to ask a couple of, I'm going to call them lightning round questions, 30 seconds to answer each.
Okay.
I'm going to throw a couple at you now, but what does diversity mean to you personally? So obviously it means different things to different people.
For me, it is about difference. It is about bringing, and that's visible and invisible. The diversity is about, I've shared my experience, my life experience, my culture, my heritage. So for me, diversity is really about that, the mix of what makes everybody themselves.
And what does success mean to you?
I mean, I feel like I've had a successful day when I can see the impact that I'm having on people. So that's what success looks like for me. When I'm leaving the organization in a better place, when I'm moving the agenda along, even if that's slow, but actually when we're making progress, that's what success looks like for me. I want people to be able to look up who didn't necessarily think that they could be a leader, to look up and maybe see me and think, well, if Joanne can do it, I can do it. And that's success. If we can spotlight somebody that maybe wouldn't have made it otherwise, and that's what success is for me.
I love that. It's about the influence, the positive influence, and the outcome of that. And I love that you can see, and you've had people write to you saying, thank you. So I think it's about real models. It's not always about role models. It's about those that they show up every day, they do their very best work, and that's rewarded in the leaves coming out of the trees.
I love that. That's such a nice thing, and that is exactly why I do it. It's it just fills my heart when I see people being successful. Then that's, for me, is what success looks like.
I can see your eyes light up when you say that. And as I was saying that, I was thinking, oh my God, I'm being so cheesy, but it is completely true. You watch the people that you've nurtured and you've nourished, and it's like from little acorns grow big oak trees. And it's kind of like, you become this, the oak, and it's growing, and, where you go, you learn new things. And with each of the branches, there's others that come off that. And it's really quite beautiful, really, really quite beautiful. Where do I start in summarising the conversation from today, Joanne?
Good luck.
So I need it. It's always enjoyable speaking to you. I always learn something else. I think data, insight, storytelling, and the blend of all of those things coming together. You've made me think differently about privilege, and I think it's something that we have to interweave into everyday language. It's not something that we ought to be ashamed of, even though the word itself does often bring about feelings of shame and embarrassment because of the haves, the not haves, and that's not how it ought to feel. The more that we use verbiage that can sit uncomfortably, the more we become comfortable in allowing those safe conversations to happen, and ultimately the positive change to enrich the environment with which we sit in. And so I'll leave my summary at that, because I think it really has been, it's been insightful, but it's also been quite calming. I always feel quite calm when I come off from speaking with you, Joanne, and I think that's it's a quality that not all leaders have. You know, it's the ability to listen and understand as well, and to have everything feel like a two-way dialogue. And I think in the world of inclusion, that is so important.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Joanne. My name is Layla Mackenzie-Dellis, founder and CEO of DLA Global. You've been listening to the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. Please hit subscribe. We're now at over 200 podcasts, and we have 57,000 downloads last time I checked, and thought to myself, in the vein of trees and growth, actually, how many people are we touching with this? So if you've heard this podcast and you think there's someone that really needs to listen to it, please hit share. Do subscribe, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next week. Visit us at www.dalglobal.org/podcast, or go to your favorite podcast channel and get involved. Thanks so much.